Warning! Warning! This podcast contains spoilers.
Listen at your own risk.
Welcome to Medium Shift, the podcast that investigates how stories stack up from medium to medium through the adaptation process.
Today, we go hunting for camp counselors in You Might Be the Killer.
Welcome to Medium Shift. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ev.
I remembered this week. Yeah.
You remembered last week as well.
Well, hopefully. This episode we're going to be looking at one of the more recent and vaguely obscure movies, but hopefully you've given it a bit of a watch, because we do think it's probably worthwhile. You Might Be the Killer. So, 2018 film. I'm just going to move into the plot summary. A camp counselor suffering from blackouts finds himself surrounded by murder victims. He turns to his horror movie enthusiast friend for advice and to contend with the idea that he may be the killer. Hence the title of the movie. So, what do we think of You Might Be the Killer?
I love it. I love it. I saw this at a festival recently as part of a big sort of paranormal, supernatural horror
themed festival, basically.
Yeah. And I absolutely fell in love with this. I mean, here's the thing about me. I love the horror movie aesthetic, but I'm an absolute coward.
Can confirm. Yep, yes. I watched it with this guy, and he walked out instead of saying, "What is everyone talking about?" I just closed my eyes during the scary parts, and I just saw 40 minutes of a charming coming-of-age movie.
Well, it was, with a lot of moments of blackout in between. Yes. So I found my niche is the horror comedy, where the horror is a bit lighter and the comedy kind of nullifies the thing. And this is exactly that. An absolute perfect, trope-breaking, absolute deconstruction of horror movies in a very loving way.
This is kind of like Cabin in the Woods, but kind of on a smaller scale in that respect. Almost like kind of a meta horror film in that it's self-aware of the tropes, but is also reverential of them as well. Like, it's clear the writers of this obviously love horror movies, which is where sort of the comedy of it comes from. One thing before I go into actually what I think about the film is we should probably preface why we're doing an episode on this, because even though You Might Be the Killer isn't based on any sort of traditional like book or TV series or anything like that, it's actually based on a Twitter discussion between two of the writers who basically faked this conversation between this person who might be the killer at a camp and their basically nerdy horror friend who knows all the tropes of it. It's actually an interesting exchange. You can find it on Twitter as well, and that sort of discussion was so popular that it actually led to the creation of this film. That out of the way, I like this film too. I do think it's quite good and inventive. I do think the fact that it's based on a brief Twitter conversation kind of shows, and that I think it's a little bit stretched for an hour and a half, honestly. Like, I don't know if any of the writing outside of that actual exchange between the two main characters is not particularly good. I don't think any of the characters are that much worthwhile and anything like that. But that core concept, that core idea is really strong. I just don't know if it's enough to sustain an entire film. I still like it, but yeah. It felt a little bit stretched to me at the very least, which should make for an interesting conversation, because obviously this is an adaptation very different to opposed to what we've done before, which is obviously why we wanted to do it.
Yeah. You brought up the characters, which I find interesting, because it's one of the fine lines you sort of have to tread with these sort of meta horror comedy type scenarios, because there's been a few of them, and it's in general horror, a lot of the characters are bland and stereotypical, and they're just there for fodder, which doesn't make it interesting. And so when you're trying to make a movie, do you then parody and homage to those bland type characters, or do you try and give them personality, which is more like a comedy? So you sort of have to balance the line, and I think it tried to do a bit of both, but because it could not focus on everyone, there was clearly people who were just there for fodder.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, and there's an inherent dichotomy in that respect, in that a lot of classic horror movies are almost renowned for kind of awful in that respect, especially when you talk about the character work. And so, you're right, what do you do in this situation? So, So yeah, no, it's a really interesting dichotomy that they kind of have to deal with. And I think you're right. I think they attempt to do it. It feels like a lot of the ancillary characters, especially in that introduction scene early in the film, they try to give them at least some sort of level of depth and personality, but just the focus isn't really there for it to get any more fleshed out. And it really felt like, besides the two main characters, which are obviously invested in because so much of the movie is based around them, I didn't give a damn about anyone else. Which is, granted, appropriately horror movie-esque, but it doesn't mean it's not a problem, I think. So
Yeah. Well, it's also an interesting fact because the two main protagonists in this sense, one of them is the killer, and the other one is not around. They're essentially just a voice in a phone in all respects in regards to the actual camp setting.
yeah, they're not directly engaged with the action. For the most part, they get a little bit more interactive near the end of the film.
But yeah, so it's kind of hard to then find natural ways to bring out more of the other characters as well, aside from some of those little flashbacks that they had, especially with the female characters, the last two at the end.
Yeah, of course.
Of course, they needed a bit of fleshing out, but everyone else was kind of like, and you're dead.
And you're dead. I think kind of the problem that we're sort of skirting around is something that I alluded to before, but the fact that this is kind of just a cool premise that works in a funny Twitter discussion on the internet, but changing that to a feature-length movie reveals a lot of problems. And granted, one thing I should also preface, considering what this is based on, this movie is so much better than it has any right to be. This could have just been the same lame gag for basically 90 minutes, but it's clear that they have a lot of reverence and love for the horror movie genre, and really lean into that, as well as just having really great actors and settings, and quite decent effects, surprisingly, as well. Yeah. So it's I think it just sort of, it feels a little bit restricted by the source it's drawing from, which is obviously something regarding adaptations that we've discussed before, but I think it's definitely really apparent in this film. So
I find one of the things I really like about it is the interesting way it plays with time, because of the way it's sort of framed as general skipping back and forth to various points in the story, all out of place, and you only really knowing how the timeline works through how many councillors are dead at the time, thanks to the lovely big red title cards that come up between scenes.
Oh yeah, see, that is great.
Yes.
So that's kind of what I'm pointing to when I said, like, the writers definitely still love their stuff and know their stuff, and that's one of the good things that they do to expand on it. So yeah, that was really cool. Even near the end of the film, we got a little bit tired as it was going along, but especially at the end when it says councillors dead, all/one alive.
Undead councillors, one, yeah.
Undead councillors, that's the one. So.
Although I did like the dead councillors 11 and then just crossed out and then 10 and then crossed out again and 11.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
But so one other thing I sort of want to discuss, particularly if we want to move into talking about the source, which is, granted, there's not a lot to talk about there, but I did actually hear some sort of recent theory, if I'm going to bring academia into this again, which I'm going to, where there's this premise in narrative more recently that so much narrative is sort of built on kind of linear construction, but there's also this idea of database storytelling, which is having facets of information, connected use and such, sort of create these narratives and story like across the entire internet and things like that. This, I think, is a really good example of it. The one example that I heard when talking about this was actually Slender Man. The fact that kind of like the...
Marble Hornets?
Yeah, sure. But no, the myth of like the meme and the creepypasta of Slender Man that sort of started as this one idea and then spread out kind of like a virus across the internet. A lot of memes work a similar way as well. But the fact that there are these narratives being constructed on so many different platforms by so many different users that it's all being collated into one. And I think it provides an opportunity for storytelling that is really distinct and really interesting and unique. And besides getting onto the whole computational side and interactive narrative and story, because that's a whole other ballgame, I do think films and just everything based around this kind of database storytelling, like Slender Man, there's another film that's being made based on a Twitter discussion regarding Rihanna in a heist movie, I think. I don't remember the exact discussions. So this is happening more and more, and I think You Might Be the Killer is indicative of kind of this new interesting trend that computational narrative and storytelling has kind of led to, which is one of the reasons that I think we should talk about it, because I think it's really interesting in that respect. So,
and horror has really sort of been at the forefront of this new sort of paradigm of narrative storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's some fantastic stuff out there. We mentioned before Marble Hornets, which is started great. I'll leave it there. But there's also these other things. There's a Twitter account, which And the story is basically called The Sun Is Gone.
Oh, I
and
haven't heard of this.
Basically an entire narrative told through one person's perspective on Twitter.
Oh, interesting.
Using a few videos and photos, but mainly through tweets. There's not entirely horror, but the classic Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, the YouTube series.
Yeah.
Which has been analysed to hell and back by everyone. Even in terms of video games, we bring back Slender with the 8 pages, which really sort of helped solidify a few of its main ideas, which are now have been taken on by some of the actual movies based on Slender Man, and the really terrible Marble Hornets adaptation. We might get to that at some point.
Sure.
Yeah, and some really interesting stuff out there. I'd recommend a YouTube channel called Nightmind.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Yeah, he just sort of analyzes and looks at and reveals a lot of these sort of interesting, creative ways of talking about horror and the supernatural. One of the things that actually brought me to him was his analysis of both unedited footage of bears.
Oh, yes.
And
yeah, of course.
This House Has People in It.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one.
Which is sort of like the spiritual successor. It's by the same Alan Resnick.
Really? Okay.
Who directed unedited footage of bears and Alan Tutorials, another YouTube series, which is all very dark and interesting. So I highly recommend looking him and looking at all the stuff he's sort of looked at.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, I think you're getting to a really good point there, especially when you mention regarding how horror is so good for this. Because so much about horror, like so many of the best horror movies, sort of focus on our fear of the unknown and things coming from different directions that we cannot perceive and things like that. And one of the great things about database storytelling is that it makes the narratives kind of ethereal in a way. Like, it's really hard to sort of catalogue, if you want to use Slenderman as an example, the way he sort of spread across the internet. You can figure out his inception point, but so many different voices and people and artwork have sort of contributed to this myth that it makes him feel so much more like a myth, essentially. And there's this real strange and ethereal quality to it, which I think really enhances the nature of horror fiction. And I think it's a really, really good example of how database storytelling, not only in this film, but also in the internet in general, can be really interesting in regards to the stories it creates. So, I mean, all of this is premised on a film that isn't an incredible example of database storytelling, because obviously it's literally just drawing from the one conversation, but I think it is still indicative of a wider trend that I think is really interesting. So, yeah. Do we want to talk briefly about the Twitter discussion ourselves? So,
yeah, let's bring it up. We've already theorized horror to a boring element. Let's theorize the comedy to an incredibly boring element now.
Sure.
So the Twitter thread was basically two writers, Sam Sykes being one of them, and the other being Chuck Wendig, both quite known for fantasy novels and for comic books and things. And it was basically, from what I gather, an improvised Twitter thread where it was just the two of them replying to each other's tweets for however long, and basically built a story out of that. And it's almost identical to the conversation that Sam and Chuck have in the film.
Yeah, it's taken almost verbatim on a couple of occasions. So, yeah.
Including even the ending and the surprise twist at the end also came from that. So hopefully, if you haven't seen the movie, why are you listening to this?
Because none of this would make any sense.
No. Also, we've spoiled a bunch.
Yeah.
But even if you go read the Twitter first, that's also going to spoil you. So in a weird sense, I recommend watching the movie first and then reading the Twitter feed.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good idea, honestly. Because obviously the film was a much more significant experience than just reading a bunch of tweets in a row. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, like reading that conversation, because I read it after watching the film as well. And it is very amusing, and I can definitely see why something like that would have hit virality as well, because it's a very interesting premise. But there's just, I don't know, the fact that someone can sort of look at that and then realize, oh yeah, there's actually a premise for like a feature film in this too, which I think is really quite interesting, because I think sort of based on the conversation, like the premise is there and the basis, but there's so much more you need to do to kind of turn it into a movie with all the characters and, you know, the actual setup, which we've obviously already talked about before. But I think it does make for a really interesting example of, you know, an adaptation. So
one of the things I found, I keep saying one of the things I find interesting. There's a lot of things I find interesting in
we
this
find
movie.
many things interesting.
Yes. But yeah, in this, in the sense of the characters, there's also, for both the horror and the comedy element, you got to make the protagonist sympathetic. And I think they did that well in the movie, because in the source, you look at that, there isn't a whole lot of sympathy for either one of the they're very flippant about the murdering, and even at one point just saying, so I can kill like 2 more people and be fine, right?
Yeah,
as long as 2 of them are still alive.
The math checks out.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I didn't think about that. The fact that, I mean, this is also sort of talking about the medium, because there's something about reading just, a conversation on Twitter that there's an inherent disconnectedness there. But they 100% read as almost callous bastards. Like, oh yeah, all these people are dead, but I'm just trying to figure out how I can survive this situation. Yeah, where in the movie itself, they're both surprisingly sympathetic characters. Like, I legitimately cared about the guy in the end, to be honest. Great performance as well, which I definitely think adds to it. But the script was there to really support it too.
Yeah, it really hit home for me when there was a shot of Alison Hannigan's character of Chuck just sort of slumped with the phone down after it's been hung up by Jamie.
I know the one.
Yes, and that's where it sort of hit me. I'm like, oh shit, I care about both Sam and Chuck, and I'm really worried, and that's why I'm really happy about the little surprise twist at the end.
Yeah, great. That was such a great tease to end the movie on, because I really had no idea where it was going after that 2-year jump. I know that sort of referenced the sequels or something, but I didn't realize they were going to do anything like that. But it was a really, really great kind of tease to end on. That whole ending, I think, is actually quite clever. Where I think it slumps is kind of in the middle for the most part, when it kind of gets plodding along, when it's constantly cutting back and forth and not an incredible amount is happening. But the end and the beginning, I think, are really quite strong. So, which is kind of, once again, talks to the Twitter feed, because that's where all the conversation ends up going. So, yeah. I'm trying to figure out if there's anything else we want to talk about in relation to the film.
I just really want to say my favorite joke, because it hits real home with me.
Yeah, okay. Go
is
for it.
him trying to unlock his phone while covered in blood. I don't know why that stands out so much, but with the trouble that I've had unlocking my phone, even without blood covering my face.
Wow, okay. You have personal experience in regards to the blood, or just generally speaking, trouble unlocking a phone? I mean, you do have a mask.
Moving on.
to podcast listeners at home, which is everyone, which isn't us, he does have a mask sitting next to him, which he intentionally brought for this podcast.
It is one of many I have sitting in my house.
Maybe fairly unnerved when he arrived this morning. But, yeah, that was really good. And there's a lot of really, you can tell these are good writers, for the most part, obviously. I think the lack of material kind of dooms them a little bit. For the most part, I think it's really quite good and really funny.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot of really, really great gags in this movie, especially, God, the first couple of times when it comes up with counselor's deaths. A lot. I think it's exceptional. It's such a really, really funny way and a clever way of signposting where the non-linearity of the story is, so... I think it's great.
And in regards to when we were talking about the bland characters before, there is one particular character whose sort of blandness is intentional in the sense that everyone just knows him as the Kayak King.
Oh, yes! I almost forgot about him. Oh, yeah, he was fantastic.
Despite the fact that they are, in fact, canoes.
Yes. Yeah, as that was heavily stated over and over again. Yeah, that was actually a really good recurring gag as well. I did enjoy that. Yeah. It's funny, the more I think about this movie, the more I think there's actually a lot of really good stuff in there. It's just, while watching it, it didn't quite come together as much as I would have liked.
It's certainly one that bears repeat viewings.
I feel like this would be another one I give a watch. So one of the things we kind of talked about earlier, which we could sort of segue into another point of discussion, is kind of this trend of meta horror movies that are so self-aware while also appreciative of the genre at the same time. And this one very much fits into it, like this Cabin in the Woods, which funnily enough, the lead actor of this film also is in Cabin in the Woods as well. There's Shaun of the Dead 2. There's a whole series of them these
There's
years,
one
honestly.
that I was going to bring up in Random Talk, but I'll just do it now and think of something else later.
Yep.
Was another meta horror comedy starring a redhead from a previous Joss Whedon TV series, and that's Tucker and Dale vs. Evil.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a great one as well.
A favourite of this podcast, Alan Tudyk.
Yes. The late and great? No, he hasn't died yet.
No.
The great Alan
He's
Tudyk.
never dying.
No, he's immortal, obviously. Alan Tudyk will live on in all of us.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I second that. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil is great, and everyone should check that movie out. So, yeah, it is really interesting, especially when we're going to talk about the horror genre. If I'm going to bring in academia briefly for one moment as well, there is kind of this...
You say briefly, it never is.
No, it's no. Sorry, you can't sort of briefly summarize academia. But one of the really interesting things that people talk about in regards to genre and in regards to sort of art movements and things like that, there's the modernist movement and then the postmodernist movement and so on. One of the things people talk about genre is that genre often starts straight. So basically, really clear about sort of the premise of it is and the tropes and everything like that, plays it really, really straight and narrow until audiences basically become accustomed to that, when it moves into sort of a self-referential phase when it starts kind of making fun of itself and so on. So you think about an example with the Westerns, which is obviously a huge genre for such a long time as well, until it started moving into parodies like Blazing Saddles and things like that. So, but then after that, what tends to often happen is once everyone becomes so self-aware and people become tired of that, it kind of moves into a phase of new sincerity when it returns to those tropes and starts playing it straight and so on and so forth. So you can almost kind of see that today in that it's not obviously not clear-cut and that we're not going through distinct movements of a genre, but you can definitely see how sort of the horror slasher films peaked in the 70s and 80s, then it moves into films like Scream and New Nightmare, and then later down the line Shaun of the Dead and this film obviously, and now we're starting to move into kind of a new sincerity phase with the remake of It and Hereditary, Halloween as well, and a lot of other films that are kind of harkening back to like sort of classic horror films and the tropes of taking themselves super seriously. And I think that movement is really interesting, honestly. And this one obviously fits into kind of the self-aware phase of it. And I just think it's a really interesting point worth discussing, because self-aware horror is a surprisingly big kind of subgenre once I started thinking about it, honestly.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's sort of, I think especially because we're sort of in that sort of transitioning period where a lot of the parodies now are less straight parodies and more these sort of very much homages to those things. Not quite straight yet, because they're still very self-aware.
yeah.
But very much for the love of the genre.
Oh, absolutely. And I think like another one which obviously we're not really going to get the chance to do, we might be able to justify it in relation to Dawn of the Dead, but Shaun of the Dead is great in that it definitely starts as kind of like a sort of a self-aware parody of zombie movies, but the longer the film goes, the more it basically just becomes a classic zombie film, before at the end of the film, the climax is basically a pure, almost horror experience, basically. There's still jokes in there, but it takes itself seriously in a way that the beginning of the film didn't start. And I think that kind of movement is just really interesting. And as sort of you're talking about, it's not an outright parody. It's just kind of... It's a loving rendition, a self-aware loving rendition of the genre, which is what this film is as well. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. This is a brief tangent as well, but how exactly do you feel regarding Cabin of the Woods? I assume you've seen it, haven't you?
I have seen it.
Yeah.
It took me a while to see it, actually, because a lot of I didn't see it in cinema because I thought it was just a straight horror like everyone else.
Well, that's how it was marketed, interestingly enough, so...
And so I went, the name Joss Whedon I liked, but this doesn't seem to be my style, so I left it, and I eventually heard enough about it that I came back around and watched it. And I thought, I have mixed feelings, honestly, about Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah.
I do enjoy it, but I feel at times it got a bit jarring jumping between the cabin and the evil...
Oh, the underground bunker.
Underground bunker.
Yeah, sure.
Between the two. And I was a little lost at the ending. I don't know how I feel about that sort of big climax with Sigourney Weaver and the two final characters.
Oh, yeah, and the old gods and everything.
One of
like
them
that.
played by Fran Kurtz, who is Sam in this movie.
Surprise, surprise. Connection right there. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think Cabin in the Woods is an interesting one because unlike this film, which is obviously reverential of horror films, that one feels more of a critique, I guess. Yeah. It feels like it's aware of the tropes, but it's also kind of making fun of them and criticizing them in a way that this film kind of does, but I think it's a lot more appreciative, basically. Like, it's sort of talking about the fact that like the person on the phone, the reason that this movie actually happens and pans out the way it does is because she loves horror movies and because she is aware of the tropes. Where in Cabin in the Woods, the fact that they don't know about the horror tropes basically is what condemns them. So I don't know. I think it's just a really interesting parallel. So.
And there's the interesting point in sort of a setup where it's in You Might Be the Killer, they go through the classic logic, what you would actually do in this situation, calling the police, trying to bunker down, trying just to stay alive. And then when those don't work, they realize they're in a bit more of a horror type situation, where it was in Cabin in the Woods, it's literally stated that they're forcing it to happen like a horror movie.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of whether a movie happens organically or whether it's very forced, and these two sort of fit those ideas, and it's how you feel a parody should be done, or in this case, an homage should be done. I think.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of contrasts and parallels between these two films. Even though obviously this one is a much smaller budget and a much lesser known film, where Cabin in the Woods is like really big and beloved and all that. But I think if we were ever going to do sort of like a comparative piece between two films, which obviously doesn't really fit this podcast, I think that'd be an interesting one to do. So do we want to move into Do It Differently, or is there anything else we wish to discuss?
No, I think I've basically covered.
Yeah, I think we've gone on enough tangents, honestly.
Yes.
People may have noted that we've sort of filled up this podcast with quite a few other things, because there is obviously not a lot of source material and film to draw on in this, which is great, because obviously it's something worth discussing. But yeah, it leads into a lot of more interesting discussions, I think. So Do It Differently?
Yes. Jingle, jingle, jingle.
There we go.
Yeah.
We're so good at that. All right, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Up to you.
Oh, you say that every time. All right, fine. I'll go first.
Okay.
So once again, maintaining my status quo basically is that I would kind of change from the ground up how this project was approached. And as much as I enjoy the original film, I think this original premise probably would have worked a little bit better as a short film. Really, so keep the same writers, you can even keep the same actors, but just trim a lot of the fat, make it only like maybe 8 to 10 minutes, focus almost entirely on that conversation, and just kind of leave it as is. Like, obviously, it's not going to be as big of an experience as the movie itself, but I think the adaptation will work quite a bit better in that medium, basically. I mean, besides that, there's not an incredible amount. I just think keeping it shorter, I think, and keeping it more condensed and focused on the actual Twitter conversation, I think would have been more worthwhile, so... What about you?
Because I like this movie a lot, so I'm not doing a whole lot to change it.
Sure.
But my main point is going to be, there's a point where it is revealed that one of the characters, once thought dead, no longer dead. And at that point, it sort of starts being less of your classic horror and starts sort of twisting some of those tropes around. You see... The last girl actually goes and straight up murders someone, and then goes and murders Sam, despite the fact that there's a chance that it could actually save him. I think that entire sort of twisting should be a bit longer. I felt it was kind of rushed and didn't achieve as much as good, so I would actually bring that sort of further up.
Oh, okay.
Not necessarily the plot points, but that idea of maybe this isn't quite the horror movie we were expecting. Maybe there could actually be something that happens that changes at the end.
So bring those subversion of those final tropes in earlier in the film, like kind of introduce it a little bit earlier? Or?
Yeah, not even introduced, but just sort of have that idea, that almost third act kind of feeling a bit more into the final sort of killings.
Okay.
So it just starts a bit earlier, and there's... Yeah, and make those final deaths a bit more interesting, because the first one's good because they're very classic horror and there's twists, but by the end it sort of just feels like it's very slasher, and then suddenly change and we're into subversions.
That's fair. That's something I can agree with. I think it sort of kills get a little bit less creative as it kind of goes along, so yeah. No, fair enough. I could probably get behind that as well. Alright, do we want to move into what we've been reading / discussing / watching and so on and so forth recently?
Sure. Well, I already brought up what I was originally going to do.
Hey, you can just reiterate it if you want to. Up to you.
Right. Let's do with that.
I mean, it's a great movie.
Yeah, seriously. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. It is another horror comedy meta homage, and it is fantastic. For those who don't know, it's about two...
Hillbillies?
Hillbillies, yeah, I guess is the right term. Going up to repair the cabin, and a whole bunch of teenagers who are also going for a camping experience. And... through a few miscommunications and the leadership of a rather horror-obsessed teenager, the teenagers think they're stuck in a horror movie where the hillbillies are killing them, and the hillbillies are just trying to work out why all these kids are killing themselves around them.
Yeah. There's some real quality slapstick in this movie, and yeah, also again that it essentially subverts it in that the horror movie villains are basically unaware of the fact that they're being presented as villains, and that they're both these couple of really lovable people. Yeah,
and they're not even really villains in this particular sense, because they're not actually doing any of the classic horror stuff. It's just so it's almost a Final Destination. These just keep happening, and the kids just keep dying.
Yeah, in more and more elaborate ways, which is fantastic. So. Yeah, I will second this. I think Tucker and Dale vs. Evil is great. Yeah, really funny, not incredibly scary, but still gory enough that it's characterized as a horror film. And obviously, the legendary Alan Tudyk just makes every scene he's in, which is great. So,
Well, so we've had a doozy of a day.
Well, keeping in my recommendation, I'm going to maintain my horror theme. Quite a different horror film as well, honestly, but I finally got around to watching a classic that I had not yet seen before, but I'm meaning to see for a long time. I assume you've heard of Rosemary's Baby?
You finally got around to watching that.
Yeah, have you seen it? Or
Again, coward. So, not really.
Okay.
But, yes. I've read the synopsis, I've watched clips out of order and in a very lit room with the computer very far away from me.
I see.
But I have essentially watched it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Great. Well, here's my chance to try and properly sell you on it then. So for people who don't know, Rosemary's Baby is basically a horror classic, directed by Roman Polanski. I believe came out in the mid to late 60s. And it's essentially about this couple who move into a new apartment with some strange neighbors, where the couple is trying to have a baby, but once she does fall pregnant, a lot of really strange things begin to happen. I won't necessarily spoil a lot of that, because so much of this movie is based around the unease and the tension, and basically the anxiety and the paranoia about what is going on to this pair. And it's a really ridiculously well-made movie. Like, everything about it is so good about almost building tension and unease and nerves. It's not a straight-out horror film in that there's no real gore and there's no, like, jump scares or anything like that. The only thing that really makes it that scary is just kind of the slow build of tension and absolute paranoia, because it constantly is playing on your expectations about what is happening and what is going on. It has so many fantastic performances. It is directed by Roman Polanski, so take that as you are, but I try and compartmentalize that. But I think it is absolutely a must-see in regards to classic horror movies, and might actually be one of my new favourite horror movies of all time, so I'm probably going to rewatch it again maybe in a few months to see if it holds up, but the first time was really good. So I actually think, considering this isn't a straight-out horror film, you might still be able to manage it, because it is kind of... It has like veins of sort of like a paranoid drama thriller as opposed to being horror, even though it is still definitely creepy. But it's not like, it's not It or anything like that. It's not going to be sort of, oh dear God, this is the moment where I look away from the scene again, so... Yeah, exactly. And he jumps out of a fridge.
Yes.
But, yeah. I think it is really, really good. So.
It is something to go. And it solidifies the idea that children and horror apparently go together.
Oh yeah, hand in hand. There's something really strange about how constantly there are creepy kids in horror movies. I think I actually had a friend who was doing a PhD on that. I might have to read that one day. But yeah, it's real good. And this is kind of the one that started the trend of, oh, creepy kids, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
well, I mean, you could also attribute that to The Omen. And
what year was The Omen?
I'm trying to remember. The original one was, I want to say 70s, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, I think Rosemary's Baby might have still been before it. But, I mean, there's a bunch of connected films, because obviously The Exorcist is part of that as well. Yeah. Poltergeist as well. They're coming.
Children of the Corn.
Children of the Corn, yeah. There's a lot of films. Oh, man, maybe we should just turn it into a horror podcast. Which is weird, because neither of us are really big horror fans.
No.
But we still seem to watch a lot of them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great ones out there. Anyway, thank you for everyone who listened to this episode of Medium Shift. We can be found at our usual spot at mediumshift@gmail.com. Feel free to send whatever you want, preferably not dismembered body parts. Hell, I don't even know how you would attach a dismembered body part to an email, but still. And next week, next episode, we're going to be doing, once again, an interesting adaptation with, frankly, not a lot to go on, but unfortunately not for good this time.
Yeah, we're doing Angry Birds.
Yeah, this is not going to be a fun episode. It's probably going to be a fun episode to listen to, because I guarantee I'm going to get really angry again. But, yeah, so next week we're going to be talking about a film based on a game that is basically just throwing birds at pigs. So.
And microtransactions.
Yeah. I wonder how they're going to factor that into the film. There's like halfway through, it's like, please insert $2.50 to watch the next scene. Honestly, I wouldn't put that ahead of EA if they ever made a film. Anyway, thank you for listening. Until next time, fare thee well.
Bye.